Let's imagine that I know nothing about American history, and I ask you to summarize it for me in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes to summarize over 250 years of people, events, wars, social movements, laws, leaders, culture, all of that, and you gotta sum it up? Now imagine trying to do the same thing for 2,000 years of a nation's history. That's what we're trying to do when we say we're gonna summarize the story of the Old Testament. It's the story of Israel, and it covers 2 millennia. Now, if I was going to try and explain the American story, I might start by highlighting a few of the key leaders and events at pivotal moments. I might talk about George Washington and the Revolution, or Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, or FDR and World War II, or the Cold War, or so on. I'd pick these kind of tentpole moments when we say, you gotta know this. And it wouldn't tell you everything, but if you knew those major events, it'd help you get your bearings as you fill in the rest of the details. This is what we're going to do for the Old Testament. I'm going to give you 5 major people or events at key moments in Israel's history, and they'll help you find your way as you start to learn more of the story of the Old Testament. Here are the 5 things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Adam, Abraham, Moses, David, and the exile. Let's start with Adam. The story of the Bible, as we've talked about in a previous module, starts with creation. God made a good world, and he placed human beings to be his image to rule over the world that he made. Human beings were meant to be the kings and the queens, ruling God's creation on God's behalf. And in this opening scene of the Bible, what we see is God has placed his people, a couple called Adam and Eve, in his place, a garden in the land of Eden, to enjoy his presence and to serve his purpose. And these 4 things were all held together by the presence of God's king, whose name was Adam. Now there in the Garden of Eden, God placed 2 trees. One was called the tree of life, and the other was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And these represented 2 paths, 2 ways that human beings could go. The tree of life represented a life of dependence on God, where we draw our life from him, where we say we get everything we need from him and we follow his way. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil represented the choice to say, I'm going to take matters into my own hand. I'm going to decide what I think is good and bad. I'm going to decide what I think is wise and foolish. I don't need God to do that. I'm going to be the king. I'm going to be the queen. And so human beings were not content to simply be like God, to be made in his image. They wanted to be God. And so at the very beginning, the first human beings chose to walk away from God. They chose to reach out for that tree of the knowledge of good and evil and say, we're going to determine for ourselves what we think is best for us. And so they walked away from God. Humans refused to serve God's purpose, which meant they were exiled from God's place and no longer had access to his presence. Everything fell apart. And this is the problem that the whole Bible is trying to address. How do we get back to that place? How do we get back to Eden? How do we put together what was broken? His people, his place, his presence, and his purpose, all under his king. The second part of the story is Abraham. And this is where God begins to solve the problem. He puts his plan in place to undo what was broken in Eden. And the way he starts is by choosing a family. He starts with a man named Abraham and his wife Sarah, and they have no children. They have no hope for the future. They don't know what they're going to do, but then God shows up and he offers them a promise. He says, I want to make you a great people. I want to give you a great land. I want to be with you wherever you go. And through you, I'm going to bless all the nations of the world. I'm going to fix everything everywhere. The only thing that God asked of them was that Abraham trust him enough to follow wherever he led, to believe what his promises were and to surrender to him. And that's what Abraham does. He believes God's audacious promise and said, I'll follow you. And so God makes a pact with him, a promise. It's called the Abrahamic covenant. You're going to encounter the word covenant as you read the Bible, so you should know what it is. A covenant is a promise that unites 2 people. 2 people that are not related become family through a promise. Now, the covenants that we know in our world are things like a wedding or an adoption. So you think about a wedding. 2 people that are not related, usually in most states, they get together and they make promises to each other. And by making those promises, they become a family. Or in an adoption, you have a child and some adults who are not related to each other, but promises are made and they become a family. This is what God is doing when he makes covenants with his people. He says, I'm going to make a promise and you're going to make a promise and we are going to be united as family. And so when Abraham does this, his family becomes God's people. God is starting to put together the pieces that were broken in Eden. Now, if you follow the story of Abraham's family, you find out that he has a baby named Isaac. Well, his wife has a baby, and the baby's name is Isaac. Isaac has a child named Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons, and those sons are the heads of what become the tribes of Israel. So as you read the story of the Bible, you're going to encounter these names a lot. You're going to see people described as the people of Jacob, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're going to see the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. All of these are ways of pointing back to the story and saying, we belong to this people that have this promise that God is going to be with us and he's going to work through us to bless the world. And so from generation to generation, they pass on the promise, and the people of God grow until they ultimately become a nation, the nation of Israel. God is beginning to rebuild what had been lost. The next step in the journey is Moses. By the time we get to the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, Abraham's family has grown to be a numerous people. The only problem is this: they don't have their own land. They don't have a place to live. They're actually living in the land of Egypt, which is a problem because they have become slaves to the king there, a man named Pharaoh. For 400 years, they were in Egypt slaving away. And the people were crying out to God, and God heard them, and he sent someone to rescue them. It was a man named Moses. God sent Moses to go and confront Pharaoh, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but there is a showdown between Moses and the most powerful man in the world. And God does some incredible miracles to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. He actually forces Pharaoh to let them go. The final miracle is one that you might have heard of. It's called the crossing of the Red Sea. What happens is Moses is leading the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and they get to this body of water, the Red Sea, and they cannot cross. And at this point, the Pharaoh has second thoughts, and he says, I'm going to send an army to chase them down and get my slaves back. And so he's got this army chasing them, and they're at the edge of the sea. They have no boats. They have no way across. And there they stand, and they're about to be decimated. And God says, just be still and trust me. And so Moses goes and stands at the edge of the sea. He holds up his hands, and the sea parts, and the people walk across on dry ground. And then as the Egyptian army comes, they walk onto the dry ground thinking that they're going to be able to cross and catch the Israelites as they go. But as they come along, the water wipes them away. The Israelites arrive on shore, but the army gets swept away. Now, this is one of the most famous stories in the Bible, and it gets referred to again and again and again. It's sort of the symbol of the way God rescues his people. When they are helpless, they can't do anything for themselves, God comes through and saves them in an impossible way. Once the people are on the other side of the Red Sea, Moses leads them to a place called Mount Sinai. This is a really important place in the Bible. You're going to want to remember that name. At Mount Sinai, they stand before the mountain and God comes down. And God comes down to meet with the nation to form another covenant with them, another promise that they would be joined together. They're going to be his people and he is going to be their God. And in this covenant, in this agreement between them, he gives them two very important things. The first one is a set of instructions, what is sometimes called the law or the Torah. The symbol of this, the kind of shorthand version of this, is the Ten Commandments, which you have probably heard of. These are descriptions of what it's like to be his people. Here's how you should live. Here's how you should order your life and your society. Here's what I desire for you as a people. It's God's expression of his purpose. What was lost in Eden is starting to be restored. The other thing that God gives them in this covenant is instructions on how to build something called the tabernacle. The tabernacle is this tent. They take it up and put it down as they travel all around. And in this tent, God meets with his people. In the heart of this tent, God's presence dwells. And it's the place where they go to make sacrifices and offerings to him. It's the place where the priests go in and offer prayers. It's the place where when they are atoning for the sin of the people, when they're trying to pay the price for the sins that they've committed, the high priest goes in and offers a sacrifice to do that. This tabernacle was the place where his people had access to his presence. Again, God is restoring something that had been lost in Eden. Now, all of this story takes place over the course of 4 books: Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And as I've mentioned in a previous module, those first 5 books of the Old Testament, including Genesis, are often called the Torah, the books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, and they're really the foundation for the rest of the story. But all of it is telling how God is making progress towards restoring Eden. All right, I'm going to skip forward to another really important person. It's the person of David. Now, we're skipping a lot of years here, but this is the next key turning point. What you should know along the way between Moses and David is that God led his people from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, a land in the Bible that goes by a lot of names, but most often it's called either Canaan or Israel. And this is the last piece of the puzzle, right? You've got God's people, and now they're following God's purpose because they have the law, and they're enjoying God's presence because they have the tabernacle. But now when they come into the land, they are living in God's place. All the pieces are coming back together. Now, after the people have settled in the land, they struggle for generations to truly act as one people, to live out God's law, to experience the full blessings that were promised in the covenant to Abraham and Israel. And as they're looking at this, there's a realization that they need something more. They need a king. They need God's king. And so this is what God does. He raises up a young man. He's the youngest child of 8. He's a shepherd boy. He's an underdog, someone that would be completely forgotten. And God goes and finds him and says, you're going to be the next king of Israel. You're going to be the most important king of Israel. His story is told in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The most famous story about this young man, David, is when he faced off against the giant Goliath. Goliath is a professional soldier. He is someone who is out there conquering people and defeating people, and everybody in the Israelite army is scared of him. But David shows up and he says, you know what? He may be big, but our God is bigger. He may have weapons and armor and experience on his side, but God is on our side. And so because of his faith, David says, I'm going to face him down. And so David goes up and he fights Goliath, and he doesn't come with a sword or a spear or anything like that. He comes with just a sling and a stone. And the story is this vivid picture of how God rescues his people. That David comes and represents the people and says, I'm going to face this giant with faith in God, and God is going to deliver, even though we should have no right of beating this guy, because God comes through on his promises. Now, as David gets established as the king, God comes to a place where he makes another covenant. He's making another promise to David. And this time he's saying, David, I'm promising you an everlasting dynasty. Your kingdom will never end. One of your children will sit on the throne of the nation forever. One of your sons will be the eternal king. And so here's the promise. There is going to be a king on the throne, and that king is going to bring together all the broken pieces that were lost in Eden. It sure looked like this is what was coming together in David's day. You've got God's people, and they're living in God's place. They experience God's presence. They're following God's purpose, and now they're all being brought together under God's king. But it was too good to be true. You see, David was just like all of us. He was a sinner. And even though all the pieces of the puzzle were in place, the problem was inside of David. His heart was bent. And so this led on a path towards the 5th part of the story, which is the exile. You see, David was just like Adam in the garden. He grasped after something that he shouldn't have. He overstepped his authority as the king, and he used his royal authority to summon a woman to his chambers. He got her pregnant, and when he found out about it, he arranged for her husband to be killed in battle, and he took her for his wife. It was a sin that was deeply, deeply tragic. And it was the first step in unraveling David's kingdom and the ultimate downfall of Israel. It pulled on that thread of all the things that were coming together, and they were shattered again. So over the course of Israel's history, each king after that got progressively worse and worse. Now, there were shining exceptions, of course, but even the best of the kings of Israel could not stop the momentum. The first thing that happened is Israel split into 2 kingdoms. There was a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. You're going to want to remember this. This is a thing that confuses people early on when they're reading the Bible. Sometimes the people of God in total are called Israel, and sometimes Israel refers just to the northern tribes of Israel. There's also Judah, which is just the southern tribes, which sometimes is also a shorthand for all of the people. And so it gets a little confusing, but you should know that's what those terms refer to. But it wasn't meant to be that way. There wasn't supposed to be a division, but because of the sin of David and the subsequent kings, it happened. Over time, the wickedness of the northern kingdom got so bad that God allowed an empire to come in and simply conquer them. The Assyrian Empire comes in and takes them off the map. A few generations later, the southern kingdom follows the same path. They get more and more wicked, more and more abandoning God, and God allows another empire to come in, the Babylonian Empire. They come in and conquer Judah. Now, here's what happens when Babylon comes in, because this is a kind of a unique thing. The Babylonians come in, they conquer Jerusalem, they destroy the temple, but what they do is they take the people out of the land and bring them to the land of Babylon. This event is what's called the exile. It's the downfall of all of Israel's king, but it results in them being brought into a foreign country and a foreign place. But it was at this moment that it looked like all was lost. You see, God's people are removed from God's place. They have no access to God's presence. And because they've abandoned God's purpose, it looks like it's all over. And it all started with the failure of God's king. This is the story of the Garden of Eden repeated all over again. The exile from God's presence. All of this story is told in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so here's the question at this point. Is it all over for Israel? Did their unfaithfulness mean that God was going to abandon his promises? Or did all of those covenants with Abraham and Moses and David, were they still in play? Would God still do what he said he would do? Or is it too late? We screwed it up. Well, this is where a group of people called the prophets come into play. The prophets are messengers from God. Sometimes when we think of the word prophet, we simply think, well, they're people who tell the future, right? Like they say what's going to happen sometime in the future, and that's kind of their job. Occasionally, prophets are doing that, predicting the future. But more often than not, what they're doing is giving a message from God. They're saying, here's God's perspective on this situation. Here's what he thinks about this. I want you to know how God sees all of this and what he expects from you in this situation. So before the exile, the prophets would come along and they'd try to warn the people. They say, this isn't going somewhere good. You need to stop this. You need to repent and turn back to God. Maybe this can be prevented. But then after the exile, when it seemed like all was lost, they came with a message of hope. They said, it may look like we have failed, and we have failed, but God has not failed. He still is going to keep his promises. He's going to make of us what he wants. And so they would reiterate these wild promises. They'd say, it's going to come back. He's going to restore his people. He's going to bring them back to his place. He's going to bring back his presence with his people. And you know what? He's actually going to give us new hearts, hearts that are actually able to keep his purposes, to follow his law. And the capstone of the whole thing is that the prophets promised that God would send a new king, a new descendant of David, someone we call the Messiah. Now, the Greek word for Messiah is Christ, so that's a little preview of who this might be. As we get to the end of the Old Testament, this is where things are settled. You've got the people who are still suffering the consequences of exile, although a little bit of restoration has started. But they're still looking at this and saying, this is not what God has promised. And they're hearing the prophets say, something greater is coming, something greater is coming. And they're still waiting for the Messiah to bring full restoration, which is where the story of the New Testament comes in.